At 2:28 on a cold February morning, an elderly woman's heart monitor suddenly stopped communicating. Not because her pacemaker had failed, but because the phone connected to it had disappeared. Just minutes earlier, someone wearing gloves and a face covering had approached her front door. By sunrise, Nancy Guthrie was gone. No goodbye. No sign that she had simply walked away. Only a carefully reconstructed timeline. And one question investigators are still trying to answer. Who entered Nancy Guthrie's home that night, and why? Because what detectives uncovered over the following days would transform an ordinary welfare check into one of the most puzzling disappearance investigations of 2026. This wasn't a case that unfolded all at once. Instead, it revealed itself piece by piece. A disabled security camera. A recovered image investigators never expected to find. A mysterious figure standing outside Nancy's home. An unexplained gap in the timeline. And a family forced to ask a question no one ever wants to ask. Where is she? Tonight, we'll reconstruct the final known hours before Nancy Guthrie vanished, examine the evidence investigators have publicly released, and separate confirmed facts from speculation. Because sometimes, the smallest detail becomes the key to the biggest mystery. Before she became the focus of a nationwide investigation, Nancy Guthrie was simply Mom. To millions of Americans, her daughter Savannah Guthrie is a familiar face from morning television. To Nancy, she was simply family. Friends described Nancy as independent, kind, and deeply devoted to the people she loved. Even while managing health challenges, she remained active in her church community and valued living independently. She followed familiar routines. She answered calls. She kept appointments. Her family knew what an ordinary day looked like for Nancy. Which is why, when that routine suddenly broke, they knew something was terribly wrong. One missed appointment doesn't usually become national news. Unless it's the first sign that something unimaginable has happened. Saturday, January 31, 2026. By every account, it was an ordinary evening. Nancy traveled by Uber to a family dinner, spending time with loved ones before her son-in-law drove her home. Electronic records later showed her garage door opening at approximately 9:48 p.m. and closing roughly 2 minutes later. That simple digital record would become the last confirmed indication that Nancy had safely returned home. Nothing about the evening suggested danger. No emergency calls. No reports of suspicious activity. Nothing to indicate anyone was watching. Or at least, nothing investigators had discovered yet. Because sometime after Nancy turned out the lights, someone else may already have been watching her house. The Catalina Foothills isn't known for violent crime. It's a community where quiet nights are expected. Nancy lived alone. She had security devices. She followed routines that rarely changed. From the outside, her home appeared secure. But investigators would later conclude that sometime after midnight, that sense of security was deliberately interrupted. At 1:47 a.m., something unusual happened. Nancy's doorbell camera stopped functioning. Investigators have said they do not believe this was a routine malfunction. Instead, it marked the beginning of a sequence of events that would become central to the investigation. Why disable the camera? Was someone attempting to avoid being recorded? Or had they already spent time on the property before disconnecting it? Investigators haven't answered those questions publicly. But they believed this timestamp mattered enough to build much of the early investigation around it. At first, investigators believed the disabled camera meant they had lost whatever happened next. If that were true, the person responsible had succeeded. Or so it seemed. Days later, digital forensics specialists recovered images from the system that investigators initially believed were unavailable. Those recovered images changed everything. They showed an individual wearing dark clothing, gloves, and a face covering near Nancy's front door during the early morning hours. Authorities have not publicly identified the individual, nor have they stated that the person seen is definitively responsible for Nancy's disappearance. But they have made one thing very clear. They urgently want to know who that person is. Because investigators believe they may hold critical information about what happened that night. Then came another moment investigators would never ignore. 2:28 a.m. Nancy's pacemaker monitoring system failed to complete its scheduled communication through the phone connected to it. That single missed transmission became another fixed point in the timeline. What happened to the phone? Was it switched off? Damaged? Taken from the home? Investigators haven't released those answers publicly. But they believe that by this point, Nancy was no longer following her normal routine. Something had interrupted it. And whatever that was, had happened in less than an hour. Morning arrived. Family members expected to hear from Nancy. When they couldn't reach her, concern quickly began to grow. At first, there were ordinary explanations. Perhaps she was asleep. Perhaps her phone battery had died. Perhaps she'd simply stepped away. But as the hours passed, those explanations became harder to believe. Nancy didn't simply disappear from people's lives. She always stayed in touch. By late morning, family members went to her home. Within minutes, they knew something was terribly wrong. Authorities were called. What began as concern for a loved one was about to become a major criminal investigation. When deputies entered Nancy Guthrie's home, they weren't looking at the scene of someone who had simply wandered away. Evidence inside the residence led investigators to believe she had been taken against her will. Within days, the FBI would join the investigation. Search helicopters would fill the skies above Tucson. Volunteers would comb miles of desert. And investigators would uncover evidence that suggested this disappearance had been carefully planned. But the biggest mystery was only beginning. What exactly convinced detectives that Nancy hadn't left on her own? That answer changed the entire direction of the investigation. By sunrise, Nancy Guthrie should have been preparing for another ordinary day. Instead, her family was trying desperately to reach her. Within hours, deputies from the Pima County Sheriff's Department were walking through her front door. At first, the call began as a welfare check. But it didn't remain one for long. Investigators soon concluded there were indications that Nancy had not left her home voluntarily. While officials have not publicly disclosed every detail found inside the residence, they have said the evidence led them to investigate the case as a suspected abduction. For Nancy's family, the realization was devastating. The hope that she had simply gone somewhere unexpectedly began to fade. In its place came a far more frightening possibility. Someone had entered her home during the night. And Nancy was gone. As detectives secured the property, crime scene investigators began a meticulous examination of the home. They searched every room. But they weren't simply looking for fingerprints. They were searching for one mistake. Because no matter how carefully a crime is planned, almost everyone leaves something behind. Investigators have not released a complete inventory of the evidence collected inside the residence. That isn't unusual. In active investigations, certain details are often kept confidential to protect the integrity of the case and to help distinguish credible information from false leads or unreliable confessions. For the public, that silence can feel frustrating. For investigators, it can be one of the most valuable tools they have. One question quickly emerged. If this crime had been planned, how long had someone been watching Nancy? Detectives began rebuilding Nancy's final known hours. 3 timestamps would come to define the investigation. 9:48 p.m. Nancy returned home after dinner with her family. Electronic records confirmed her garage door opened and then closed a short time later. 1:47 a.m. The home's doorbell camera stopped functioning. Investigators later said they believed this was an important event in the timeline. 2:28 a.m. Nancy's pacemaker monitoring system failed to complete its scheduled communication through the phone connected to it. Less than 5 hours. 3 confirmed events. And somewhere between them, Nancy disappeared. Investigators reviewed phone records, digital logs, neighborhood activity, and available surveillance footage, carefully comparing each piece of information against the known timeline. Every minute mattered, because somewhere within those confirmed moments lay the answer to what happened that night. As news spread across Tucson, the search expanded rapidly. Deputies, search and rescue teams, volunteers, and later federal investigators searched the surrounding area. The Catalina Foothills are known for their striking desert landscape. But that same terrain presents significant challenges during a search. Rocky hillsides, dense cactus, dry washes, hidden ravines. Helicopters searched from above. Specially trained K-9 units searched from the ground. Investigators examined nearby roads, open desert, and drainage areas. Yet despite extensive efforts, there was no confirmed sign of Nancy. No verified trail. No indication of where she had been taken. The absence of evidence only deepened the mystery. While helicopters searched overhead and volunteers combed the desert below, Nancy's family waited beside silent phones, hoping each call would bring good news. Instead, each passing day ended with more questions than answers. What began as a local investigation quickly drew national attention. Nancy wasn't simply another name in a headline. She was a mother, a grandmother, a longtime member of her community. As concern grew, investigators encouraged residents to review security footage from the early morning hours and report anything unusual. A passing vehicle, an unfamiliar pedestrian, a brief moment that seemed insignificant at the time. Sometimes, those are the details that change an investigation. Reviewing hundreds of hours of footage was painstaking work. But detectives knew the smallest clue could become the breakthrough they needed. As the evidence mounted, the investigation entered a new phase. The FBI joined local authorities, bringing additional forensic resources, digital specialists, and investigative expertise. Investigators had publicly indicated they believed Nancy had not left her home voluntarily, and the investigation increasingly focused on the possibility that she had been abducted. One priority was recovering evidence from the home's security system. Initially, investigators believed the disabled camera had left them with little or no usable footage. But digital forensic specialists continued examining the system. Their work would eventually recover images investigators had not expected to obtain. Those images would become some of the most significant evidence released to the public. Just as investigators believed, they were beginning to better understand the timeline. The case took another unexpected turn. A series of communications emerged. Investigators worked to determine whether they were genuine and whether they were connected to Nancy's disappearance. If authentic, they could prove to be an important breakthrough. If not, they risked diverting attention from an already complex investigation. The next chapter would confront investigators with another difficult question. Could these messages bring them closer to the truth, or take them even farther from it? By the second week of February, investigators had assembled a timeline that was both remarkably detailed and deeply unsettling. They knew Nancy Guthrie had safely returned home after dinner with family. They knew that sometime after midnight, someone approached her house. They knew her doorbell camera had been deliberately tampered with. They knew communication from the bedside monitor connected to her pacemaker suddenly stopped. And they knew Nancy was gone. What they didn't know was where she had gone, or who had taken her. That uncertainty transformed an already urgent investigation into one of the most closely watched missing person cases in America. Almost immediately, authorities expanded their search well beyond Nancy's neighborhood. The Catalina Foothills are beautiful but unforgiving. Steep hills, dense cactus, rocky ravines, miles of open desert. Search teams carefully examined terrain surrounding the home, while helicopters and drones searched from above. Volunteers joined deputies and professional search and rescue personnel, hoping that someone might find even the smallest clue. Every tip was evaluated. Every reported sighting was investigated. Every possible route away from Nancy's home was considered. But despite days of searching, there was no confirmed trace of Nancy. No confirmed location. No publicly identified suspect. With each passing day, investigators increasingly focused on forensic evidence and digital reconstruction. Because investigators believed Nancy had been taken against her will, the FBI became heavily involved in the case. Their role extended beyond traditional investigative work. Digital forensic specialists examined electronic devices. Behavioral analysts reviewed the available evidence. Technical experts worked to recover information from Nancy's security system. What initially appeared to be missing surveillance footage wasn't necessarily gone forever. Modern digital forensics can often recover deleted files, cached images, or fragments stored on remote servers. Days later, investigators released one of the most significant pieces of evidence in the entire case. Recovered images showing a masked individual near Nancy's front door during the early morning hours of February 1. The images immediately captured national attention. The individual appeared dressed in dark clothing. Their face was concealed. Their hands appeared gloved. Authorities have never publicly identified that person. Just as importantly, they have never publicly declared that the individual seen in the images is definitively responsible for Nancy's disappearance. Instead, investigators have consistently described the person as someone they urgently want to identify because they may possess critical information about the case. That distinction matters. Responsible investigations avoid making conclusions before the evidence supports them. For the public, however, the images raised an unsettling possibility. If someone approached Nancy's home with gloves and a face covering in the middle of the night, was this crime carefully planned? Or had events unfolded unexpectedly? Investigators have not answered that question publicly. Today's investigations extend far beyond fingerprints and footprints. Every smartphone, every connected vehicle, every security camera, every electronic transaction, each can leave behind a digital footprint. Investigators examined phone records, surveillance systems, nearby camera footage, and other electronic evidence in an effort to reconstruct the hours surrounding Nancy's disappearance. Law enforcement has not publicly disclosed the results of much of that analysis. That silence is intentional. In active investigations, releasing too much information can alert suspects or compromise future prosecutions. Sometimes, what investigators choose not to reveal is just as important as what they do. As the investigation continued, Nancy's family remained in the public eye. Savannah Guthrie made emotional appeals for anyone with information to come forward. She repeatedly thanked investigators, volunteers, and members of the Tucson community who continued searching. Her message was simple. Someone knows something. Even the smallest observation. An unfamiliar vehicle, an unusual sound, or a person behaving strangely could become the missing piece investigators have been searching for. For detectives, cases like these are often solved not by dramatic discoveries, but by one witness remembering one detail at exactly the right time. Then, several weeks into the investigation, another unexpected development emerged. A series of messages claiming to be connected to Nancy's disappearance began reaching media organizations and investigators. Some demanded large payments in cryptocurrency. Others claimed to know what had happened to Nancy. Initially, authorities treated every communication seriously. In any suspected kidnapping, investigators must evaluate every possible contact, even if it later proves to be false. As the investigation progressed, law enforcement determined that some of the messages were fraudulent, while the FBI also confirmed that other communications continue to be investigated as potentially legitimate. Officials have not publicly disclosed which messages they consider credible. That uncertainty added another layer of complexity. Not every message helped the investigation. Some only deepened the family's anguish. To encourage new leads, the FBI announced a reward of up to $50,000 for information leading to Nancy's recovery or to the arrest and conviction of those responsible for her disappearance. Authorities emphasized that the investigation remained active. Every credible tip continued to be reviewed. No matter how much time had passed, Months after Nancy disappeared, investigators were still working to answer the same fundamental questions. Who was the masked individual? Why was Nancy targeted? Did more than one person participate? Where was she taken after leaving her home? And perhaps the most haunting question of all, could someone close to the investigation already know the truth? Law enforcement has not suggested an answer publicly. Without evidence, those questions remain exactly what they are. Questions. Every investigation eventually reaches a crossroads. One path leads toward answers, the other toward years of uncertainty. For Nancy Guthrie's family, that crossroads has not yet arrived. But investigators believe the case is far from over. Because somewhere, someone has seen the face behind the mask. As spring turned into summer, the headlines became less frequent. The television cameras packed up. Search teams became smaller. National attention slowly shifted elsewhere. But for Nancy Guthrie's family, time had not moved on. Every morning still began with the same question. Where is Nancy? And every night ended without an answer. More than 5 months after she disappeared, investigators continued to describe the case as an active kidnapping investigation. No arrests had been announced, and authorities repeatedly emphasized that they were still pursuing leads. Whenever a case remains unsolved, theories inevitably emerge. Some are based on evidence. Others are built almost entirely on speculation. For investigators, those are two very different things. Let's examine the leading possibilities while separating what is known from what remains unknown. The first and perhaps most widely discussed theory is that Nancy was deliberately targeted. This theory is based on several publicly known facts. Someone approached her home during the early morning hours. Investigators recovered images showing a masked individual near the front entrance. Authorities have stated they believe Nancy was taken against her will. Those facts suggest planning, but planning does not reveal motive. Investigators have not publicly explained why Nancy may have been targeted or whether they believe the suspect knew her personally. Without that evidence, the motive remains unknown. Another theory discussed by some crime analysts is that the offender may have intended to commit a burglary. According to this possibility, Nancy unexpectedly encountered the intruder. The situation then escalated into an abduction. At this time, however, law enforcement has not publicly endorsed this explanation. Nor have investigators announced evidence proving that robbery was the original objective. It's a theory, nothing more. Sometimes, the most difficult answer to accept is that investigators simply don't know. Experienced detectives often resist forcing evidence into a convenient narrative. Instead, they allow the evidence to guide the investigation. As of today, authorities have not publicly identified a motive, a suspect, or a sequence of events explaining exactly what happened after Nancy returned home. That uncertainty can be frustrating, but it's also an honest reflection of where the investigation stands. Another confusing chapter involved communications claiming to be connected to Nancy's disappearance. Several messages were sent to media outlets and investigators in the months following her disappearance. Some demanded money. Others claimed insider knowledge. Initially, every communication was treated seriously. In July 2026, the FBI clarified that some of the messages had been identified as extortion attempts or hoaxes, while other communications were still being evaluated. The Bureau stressed that the investigation remained a kidnapping for ransom case and that every credible lead continued to be examined. That distinction became important. False messages can consume investigative resources. They can also inflict additional pain on families already living through unimaginable uncertainty. As if the investigation itself weren't difficult enough. Another problem emerged. Scammers began exploiting Nancy's disappearance. According to the Pima County Sheriff's Department, fraudulent social media posts appeared online using QR codes and requests for money while falsely claiming to support the investigation. Sheriff Chris Nanos issued a public warning. Neither the Sheriff's Department nor the FBI would ever ask members of the public to send money to assist an investigation. Officials urged people to ignore the posts and report them instead. For Nancy's loved ones, it was another painful reminder that even tragedy can be exploited. Throughout the investigation, Nancy's family has remained remarkably consistent in one message: don't stop looking. Savannah Guthrie has repeatedly thanked investigators, volunteers, and members of the public while asking anyone with information, no matter how small, to come forward. She has described the uncertainty surrounding her mother's disappearance as an ongoing trauma, but she has also continued to express hope that someone, somewhere, holds the missing piece of the puzzle. For families of missing persons, hope isn't simply optimism, it's survival. Today, the investigation remains active. The FBI continues working alongside the Pima County Sheriff's Department. Authorities are still seeking to identify the masked individual captured near Nancy's home. They continue reviewing tips, re-examining evidence, following digital leads, and asking the public for help. The FBI is offering a reward for information leading to Nancy's recovery or the arrest and conviction of those responsible. Investigators remain confident that someone knows more than they have shared. Cases like Nancy Guthrie's remind us that some of the most difficult mysteries aren't solved in days, or weeks, or even months. Sometimes, justice depends on patience, on persistence, and on one person deciding it's finally time to speak. Somewhere, someone may remember seeing an unfamiliar vehicle, a person behaving strangely, a conversation that once seemed meaningless. Details like those have solved cases before. They can solve this one too. Nancy Guthrie is more than a headline, more than an investigation, more than an unsolved mystery. She is a mother, a grandmother, a friend, a woman whose family continues to wait for answers. If this case has taught us anything, it's that behind every missing person poster is a life interrupted, and a family whose world changed forever in a single night. If you have information about Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, investigators ask that you contact the FBI or the Pima County Sheriff's Department. Even the smallest detail could matter. If you believe stories like this deserve to be remembered with care, accuracy, and respect, consider subscribing to MindWhisper Mysteries. Because sometimes, the truth stays hidden only until someone finds the courage to bring it into the light. Until next time, stay curious, stay compassionate, and never stop seeking the truth.